Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Emma, the Digital Comms Manager here at Rewilding Britain. Thank you for joining our second event of the year. We've had over 1,200 tickets be nabbed up, so it's so lovely to see that you've all got such an appetite to hear from Rewilding Britain and to spend the evening with us. And what a day, because today is World Nature Conservation Day. We have got a jam-packed 90 minutes for you, so I'm not going to keep you for very long, but there are a few housekeeping bits I'm just going to get out of the way. And I will start off by just warning you to add some atmosphere to the event that I'm in the middle of a thunderstorm right now, so hopefully it won't play games with the internet. So just to say that the YouTube chat live is on and alive and active, so do drop a quick hello, tell us where you're from. We will be hosting a 15-minute Q&A at the end, so if you've got any questions throughout the event, please pop them on there. And if there's anybody in particular you want to ask that question to, just include their names as well. We're going to be live tweeting tonight, and I'd love to see the hashtag Wilder National Parks trending tonight. So please get using it, join the debates. When everybody's speaking, it will pop up with their names and their Twitter handles as well to make it really easy for you to engage with our speakers tonight. So why are we all here? Well, we've all got a vested interest in making our national parks wilder. And despite some fantastic conservation initiatives, sadly, many of our national parks are nature ecological shadows of what they once were and what we know they can be. I recently went camping in the Peat District with my 3 girls, and yes, we had fun, but I was actually really disappointed and saddened because for my childhood experiences in a tent in the Peat District, the skies just felt emptier, the ground was not as busy and as thriving, and it just felt very void of wildlife. And I knew that my children deserved more. I knew that they deserved the type of childhood that I had and the experiences that I had as a child. So Rewilding Britain, we know that rewilding 10% of core rewilding areas across our national parks will aid nature's recovery and pave the way for nature-based economies and thriving communities and creating happier, more resilient jobs. We'll be hearing more about this in detail from our speakers later on this afternoon, who all of them have been working or are living across our national parks. And wilder national parks will also boost our mental and physical well-being. Just imagine it on a hot sunny day, you're under the cool shade of an oak tree, dripping with shieldbirds, busying with red squirrels, or you might take a dip in the river, visited by dazzling dragonflies and the dance of dippers. That's the type of wilder national park I would like for me and my children to grow up in. And wilder national parks will also provide endless opportunities for exploration, foraging, exercise, and just to create a magical wild kingdom again for our children to marvel in and develop and explore. I'm now going to hand you over to Guy, my colleague, who's our policy and campaigns coordinator, and he's going to tell you more about our Wilder National Parks campaign, what ambitions we have here at Rewilding Britain, and what you can do to help us. So have a great evening and enjoy the show.
Thanks very much, Emma. Good evening and thanks for tuning in, and it's great to have so many people watching this evening. So our national parks comprise some of our most beautiful landscapes, and I feel very lucky to have moved last year to live in Devon, close to Dartmoor National Park, which I've loved in exploring. I've loved to get out to walk around its tors and its moorland and the amazing Atlantic oak woods that still cling on to many of the river valleys that border Dartmoor. But sadly, nature is not faring well in our national parks, because beneath the chocolate box views and green and pleasant landscapes, the underlying health of species and ecosystems in our national parks is frankly in a shocking state. And I just wanted to share a few stats and facts about this to kick off things this evening. Firstly, 3/4 of all nature reserves in our national parks are in poor condition. In fact, the condition of nature reserves inside our national parks is worse than the condition of nature reserves outside of them. And that's kind of really, really crazy when you think about it. Secondly, woodland cover in the Lake District National Park, just to take one example, is lower than in the city of Sheffield. There's less woodland cover in the Yorkshire Dales than in London. And thirdly, far too much land in our national parks is dominated by ecologically damaging land uses, such as inappropriately sited conifer plantations, many of them planted on peat, by intensively managed grouse moors, which are burned and denuded of much vegetation, and overgrazed species-poor grasslands. We need wilder national parks. And that's why last month, Rewilding Britain launched a campaign to demand that ministers take action. The Prime Minister has pledged to protect 30% of Britain's land and sea for nature by 2030, and that's a great ambition. But Number 10's press release at the time stated that national parks would count towards this total despite the shocking state that they're in. That pledge just isn't credible without making our national parks much, much wilder. So we're calling on ministers to do the following. We want them to create core rewilding areas on public land across 10% of our national parks. And that's something that's entirely within government's gift to do. We know because we've mapped the land in national parks that's owned by public bodies like the Ministry of Defence and the Forestry Commission, and by water companies who are also bound by certain rules around national parks. And together, they own more than enough land to deliver these 10% core rewilding areas. Secondly, we also want ministers to ensure that another 50% of our national parks become broader nature recovery areas with a mix of habitats, wildlife corridors, land uses, and government financial support for nature-friendly agriculture. So we sort of see rewilding as requiring something of a three-compartment model of a core zone, a wider regenerative zone, and then wider land uses outside of those areas. And thirdly, we're calling on the UK government and devolved administrations to modernise the legislation governing national parks so that they're empowered to upscale their efforts for nature's recovery. At present, some of the laws governing national parks stretches back over 70 years to a time long before the climate crisis and ecological emergency really became apparent. And national park authorities have been left powerless to act in the face of these 21st century threats. But if all of that sounds a little daunting or gloomy, there's also lots to be hopeful about, because the overarching theme of tonight's event is to show you what action is already being taken in our national parks and to make them wilder. So we're delighted that an increasing number of national park authorities recognise that they need to do much more to aid nature's recovery. And our rapidly growing rewilding network contains many landowners, farmers and land managers whose rewilding projects are within national parks. So we'll be hearing more about these projects and efforts from our other speakers later. None of this, however, is to let ministers off the hook. Just because some land managers and national park authorities are doing pioneering work, it doesn't mean that central government has no role. They have a critical role, in fact, in the responsibility to act, to give national park authorities the powers and the resources they need to really drive rewilding and to create wilder national parks. So please do sign our petition calling on ministers to create wilder national parks. And you can find a link to this in our YouTube chat and on Rewilding Britain's Twitter profile and on our website. So we've already got over 15,000 signatures, we've already got nearly 15,000 signatures. So a huge thanks to everyone who's already signed. But we do want many more, so please do sign and share. And let's also take heart from what is already unfolding on the ground, as we're about to hear. So that's quite enough from me. And I'd now like to hand over to David Morris, who works for the RSPB, who is their area manager for Cumbria and North East England. And he's going to be speaking about the work that he's been doing in the Lake District National Park.
Evening, folks. Pleased to speak to you tonight on the work that myself and colleagues and other partners have been doing across the Lake District National Park. I was asked by Guy to kind of come and talk about some of the work that we've been doing, particularly with the working across with the National Park Authority and the National Park Partnership, for which we sit on, about influencing management plans to make sure we can get all those sort of wild things in that we want to see those national parks delivering, that both Emma and Guy have covered this afternoon. Can I have the next slide, please? So the Lake District's well known by many people, a bit like Emma talking about the Peat District, iconic landscape, some iconic scenes, much visited, particularly during these times of COVID, but unfortunately biodiversity and some of the natural processes in that park are not in good health. It's suffered over years of kind of neglect and overgrazing, marred with other impacts now that's around climate change. But all is not lost. It can be a landscape that can benefit people and wildlife and restore those natural processes. Next slide. So as part of the Lake District Partnership, as a partner and working with a collaboration of other partners across the park, we've come up with an ambitious management plan which will try to address the state of nature along with a range of other factors across the park. And I'm pleased to say that I think the outcome of that management plan stacks against many of the other good ones that we've seen so far emerging, like Exmoor, which we'll hear about later on. But the key highlights I wanted to tell you about really are 10% of the park will be going into core nature recovery areas where natural processes will take place. And that ambitious target to try and get there by 2025 gives a real mandate to some of those exciting wilding and rewilding sites that are happening across the national park. It brings new ambitious SSSI targets that tries to get some of those poor quality SSSIs into favourable condition, and brings a raft of nature recovery targets and a new nature recovery strategy, which is part of the National Parks England Nature Recovery Prospectus, and a group alongside that will sit and develop that with the local nature partnership. There's also targets going in there around reintroduction of lost species like beaver here, in an illustration we've had done by the artist Richard Allen for some of our work at Haweswater. Widespread uptake of agri-environment schemes. So these are those buffering areas around the park that buffer those core areas where kind of farmers and other land managers are delivering high quality nature conservation delivery along with a range of other public goods. Increasing that woodland cover that Guy highlighted is quite low at the moment, but making sure enshrining the principles of right tree, right place for the right reasons. And then also some ambitious targets to see some of those failing water bodies in the national park come into condition. So overall, it's been a highly successful plan that's now just gone through consultation, ready to be ratified. Next slide, please. But for me, it also helps as a collaboration of partners working across the national park with people like the National Trust, the Wildlife Trusts, United Utilities, Lowther Estate, some of those partners. It gives real mandate for some of the work that we're already doing across the national park. Again, a very familiar artist, again, Richard Allen, has also done as a vision. This is for the Haweswater Reserve, Wild Haweswater, that we manage 4,500 hectares for on behalf of United Utilities within the core of the national park. And you'll see our vision for the park there with a much more wild feel to it, but with people, the rural economy, important things like still at the heart of that vision. Next slide, please. And in summary, well, how do you influence that change to bring it about? Well, my advice is get involved in those consultations around management plans as individuals or as organisations. Remember and remind the national parks of their core purposes and obligations, such as the 30 by 30 government target and the role that they can play against that. Remind them that the public expect and want to see nature. Successive surveys on national parks have shown that many people expect our parks to be wild and full of nature. Collaborate with others to be a strong voice. So our views going into that plan were a collaboration between a group of NGOs and like-minded land managers. Look for multiple societal benefits that provide a range of public goods, employment and education and access and recreation. And don't forget to hold people and organisations to account who should be delivering this stuff. And I think demonstration of what's possible and myth busting, so people aren't scared of concepts around kind of natural process, and that is really important with sites like Wild Haweswater, Wild Ennerdale, Lowther, Icot Hill, all these iconic sites we have in the Lake District. But the most important thing after doing the plan is ensure delivery happens. So make sure that we don't just see a plan that sits on a shelf to gather dust. We want to see more nature in that national park. Next slide. So for our contribution to what we're doing as part of delivering that vision in the national park, come and visit us at Wild Haweswater, either in person or hop on at the links below, where you can see some of the stuff we're doing in partnership with United Utilities to make this sort of part of the Lake District a bit more wilder. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Yeah, that was really encouraging and really excellent. I'm looking forward to coming and visiting Haweswater. I think hopefully in September, yeah, really also encouraged by the National Park Authority's new plan. Just some really great stuff in there, as you highlighted. So we're now going to show you a pre-recorded video from Dr. Bryony Fox, who works for the North York Moors National Park Authority. and is also part of the nature recovery team at National Parks England. And she'll be giving her thoughts about how national parks can help fix and fight the climate and nature crises.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bryony Fox. I work as the Director of Conservation at the North York Moors National Park Authority, and I'm part of a team that's been developing a national delivery plan for wildlife in national parks. As a family of national parks, we recognise that there are significant opportunities to address the dual challenges posed by the climate and biodiversity crises. We know that resilient, biodiverse and ecologically functioning landscapes can provide a whole range of environmental and social services which enable wildlife to thrive, protect communities from environmental extremes such as flood, drought and fire, and provide opportunities for recreation, enjoyment and employment for visitors and residents alike. National parks cover 10% of England. We've already committed through our National Delivery Plan for Wildlife to work together at scale to transform nature's recovery in national parks. Over the next 10 years, we commit to delivering a nature recovery programme that identifies zones to deliver concentrated habitat enhancement and improved functionality, that prioritises species to be safeguarded and reintroduced, that increases tree cover and restores peatlands, grasslands, heathlands and other habitats with the principle of right habitat, right place and right reason, and provides nature-based solutions to climate change resilience, that restores soil structure and health to improve function and implements long-term invasive non-native species control programmes, and finally establishes buffer zones and green and blue infrastructure corridors linking our national landscapes with national and community forests and urban areas to create a genuine national network where everyone can access and experience nature and wildlife at their best. With the right funding and working alongside local partner organisations, we could enhance over 90,000 hectares of land for nature in the next 10 years across our national parks. Working at a landscape scale is a strength of national park authorities. Most land in national parks is privately owned, and much of what is special has been created by farming. So we'll continue to work through our strong local partnerships to co-create plans for nature with our farmers, landowners and local communities, as well as our local statutory and voluntary sector partners. Along with farmers, landowners and local communities, we know our landscapes intimately and benefit from a wealth of collective expertise. We can work together to see opportunities to achieve sustainable change that supports the community and identifies investment in nature recovery to help support viable, high nature value farm businesses. But we also need the policies, funding and collaboration to support delivery, both locally and nationally. We've been actively working with DEFRA and ministers to make national parks part of the backbone of the National Nature Recovery Network and strengthen the role of national park management plans so that they are the local nature recovery strategies for national parks and back their implementation with stronger legal status. To achieve this, we've asked that national parks be identified as priority areas for funding within the new scheme for environmental land management, and we've been working with DEFRA on a range of tests and trials and through the Farming in Protected Landscape programme to ensure that public funding for public goods offers a sustainable funding model, delivering mutual benefits to farmers and land managers as well as for nature. The National Peat Strategy and English Tree Strategy fully recognise the need for positive action in national parks, and we've asked for a strengthened Section 62 duty to be included in the Environment Bill to place on all public bodies a clear duty to help deliver the Nature Recovery Network, along with further legislation to create powers to promote and protect nature in national landscapes on a par with built heritage or road transport. There must also be an evidence-based approach to delivering nature recovery and a common template and set of nature recovery indicators to assess the status of nature and natural capital that's needed so that recovery can be robustly and confidently measured. Finally, this work can't happen without resources, so we continue to champion the necessity for a sustainable finance model, blending public, private and third sector funding to enable objectives to be delivered and, more importantly, sustained and monitored. A more resilient and naturally functioning ecosystem, teeming with sustainable, healthy communities of wildlife and working hard to offer a range of ecosystem services to benefit nature and our health and well-being is our ultimate aspiration. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Dr. Bryony Fox for that video. In particular, I think it was really great to hear that National Parks England are backing one of the key asks in our Rewilding Britain's campaign about wilder national parks, in particular the call for a clear duty on public bodies to help deliver nature recovery in national parks. So that was really great to hear. So next up, we have something special to show you. We've been talking a lot about rewilding and nature recovery in our national parks. And now we'd like to paint you a picture of what it might look like. Rewilding Britain has commissioned an animation showing how Britain's upland areas, where many of our national parks can be found, might change for the better with more rewilding taking place. So we're delighted to be giving this animation its world premiere here tonight. So you're the very first people to be seeing it. And a very special thanks to our director, Alistair Driver, who's narrated the animation. It's just under 10 minutes long, after which we'll be having a short 5-minute break, which you can go and grab a drink or run to the loo. So let's watch together our vision for the future of Britain's uplands.
Here's a familiar upland scene in England and Wales and in parts of Scotland, with the vegetation on the hills grazed bowling green short, often on very steep slopes. This causes rainwater to run off the hills more rapidly, which in some cases leads to soil erosion. You can see landslips at the bottom of the slope on the right of the valley, which have happened because of this erosion. This is a landscape reflecting centuries of sheep farming. Sheep have been free to roam across the hills, and particularly in the last century, they've done so in very large numbers in the same places for long periods. This is why it looks the way it does, and it's part of the reason why biodiversity is so poor in these areas. Apart from intensively grazed grassland, the other dominant feature of this landscape is the dense, regimented blocks of non-native conifer forestry. These are great for timber production, but are a poor habitat for most species of wildlife that you would naturally expect to find here. And then there's the heather on the grouse moors above. It's being burned in this picture. Many grouse moor managers burn the land routinely to encourage new heather shoots, which red grouse feed on. This helps to keep the grouse numbers high, enabling more grouse to be shot for sport. But a completely heather-dominated moorland is in effect a monoculture, and as a consequence, the variety and abundance of wildlife here is hugely suppressed. Eroded peat is a typical site in many of our uplands. These peat hags in the foreground of the picture are evidence that the peat is drying out and eroding, releasing large stores of carbon. If you focus on the valley bottom, you'll see a river which has been historically straightened, widened and deepened to get water away downstream as fast as possible. The river has a main road running alongside it, and it has been embanked in places to enable what was its floodplain to be farmed all year round. All of these man-made interventions have reduced the biodiversity value of the river environment and have unwittingly increased the flood risk to communities further downstream. Red grouse are abundant in this landscape, as you would expect, but so are generalist species such as the fox, carrion crow and magpie. These species typically thrive in areas where there are lots of livestock and where specialist predator and scavenger species have declined or are absent due to persecution and habitat loss. Apart from grouse shooting and sheep farming, there's very little economic activity here. Of course, you will get a few walkers passing through. They won't be seeing much in the way of wildlife if they are, mind you, and they'll probably be hurrying on to the next viewpoint. Overall, this is very much a man-made landscape. You could describe it as green and brown and lumpy. To some, it will have an aesthetic appeal, and its remoteness may even make it feel wild, but in reality, it is far from that. In this second image, we see change taking place. This is roughly 10 years later. The biggest difference is that grazing pressure has been significantly reduced. Sheep have been taken off the hills, and that's allowing vegetation to recover. Burning has stopped on the grouse moor. Maybe shooting has stopped altogether. This change in land use will allow nature to bounce back over time. It's important to remember that a lot of nature recovery can be achieved simply by us ceasing activities that cause harm. The non-native conifers have been felled and replanted with native deciduous trees, which changes the whole look of the area and supports more wildlife. These new trees will provide a seed source for future generations of scrub and woodland without the need for planting. This will help to store more carbon in this landscape, and it significantly increases the infiltration of rain into the soil and bedrock below. An excellent example of natural flood management. Small numbers of suitable rare breed cattle are being allowed to roam freely, introducing some different grazing into the mix and providing an opportunity for this landscape to still produce good quality meat. There's been some fantastic work to restore the peatland. Drainage ditches have been blocked and eroding peat hags revegetated. The peat is getting wetter again, so now we have all this rich vegetation growing, which is great for insects, birds and other animals. It also stores more carbon and reduces flood risk because the mass of mosses and other plants that are now thriving help to hold more water above ground and slow the flow off the hills. Here, the black grouse population is bouncing back, and there's been a marked increase in the numbers of small birds and mammals, which provide food for raptors like the merlin and short-eared owl. The river has become a lot wilder. The main road has been relocated to the edge of the floodplain, and the flood embankments have been deliberately breached. Now the river is being allowed to find its own path and reclaim its natural floodplain. This should help to slow the flow of water off the land and reduce the risk of flooding downstream. Here we are, about 50 years into the future. The landscape has changed dramatically. It's full of colour, texture and life. Nature is really being allowed to take care of itself now. It's been given a helping hand with the creation of a green bridge across the main road. This allows wild animals and livestock to move more freely and safely through the landscape. And the lynx is back. There's no reason we shouldn't have lynx back in Britain in upland landscapes like this. The natural woodland here will suit their stealthy ambush hunting technique, and they'll help to manage deer numbers, which would otherwise have a big impact on the vegetation. The wildcat has also been successfully reintroduced after teetering on the brink of extinction in Britain at the beginning of the 21st century. Hopefully, well-planned reintroduction projects will see it return to many of our uplands. The previously degraded peat area has now completely transformed into a luscious mosaic of vegetation. This is great for birds and insects, including a few species like the marbled white butterfly, which have expanded their ranges northwards as a result of climate warming. There are more people here too. The rewilding this valley has led to many more job opportunities through diversification of land use. Grouse shooting and sheep farming may have ceased, but there are still livestock to be cared for, and you can see people foraging, perhaps for berries or mushrooms. There are walkers, cyclists, people camping and glamping, and the return of the beaver is drawing in more visitors to the wetlands in the valley bottom. People are also growing food on a small market garden scale, in the polytunnels and in a small orchard near the buildings. On the hills, free-ranging cattle, wild boar and red deer all provide small quantities of very popular high-quality meat for local communities. And then there are the activities we can't see here, which all contribute to the local economy, including low-impact silviculture, nature tour guiding, wild swimming, forest schools and scientific monitoring. These all bring in extra jobs and a big increase in volunteers, helping to restore vitality and economic resilience to these upland landscapes. This is a challenging but genuinely achievable vision for rewilding in our uplands. Now we need to think big and act wild to make it happen.
Welcome back, everybody. We hope you've had a chance to grab a brew for the second half of the event. Hopefully you're all feeling as inspired as I do on that first half. We've already had some fantastic speakers tonight, and on social media it's pretty much on fire. You all tweeting away using the hashtag, and there seems to be a real appreciation for the new Uplands animation, with a lot of you suggesting about what a great asset it would be for schools and colleges. So it's really lovely to have such good feedback. And so we're going to go into the second half of the event now, and we've got three fantastic speakers lined up, and they're basically going to show you the amazing work that's already underway in our national parks. So I'm going to hand over to Shayla Rao, who's up in Marlodge, and she is the Natural Heritage Advisor. So I'll hand you over to her.
Hi there, everybody. It's great to be with you tonight. Thanks to be invited to this talk at this event. I'm going to talk to you about a Scottish example of what's happening positive in a national park, the Gorms National Park. And it's going to be a quick whistle-stop tour of some work that we're doing at Marlodge Estate, which is owned by the National Trust for Scotland. So this is really about a forest coming back to life. So next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of background, Marlodge Estate sits right at the core of the Gorms National Park in the Highlands of Scotland, and it makes up about 6.7% of the park. It's a large estate, almost 30,000 hectares, and it has a wide range in altitude from 350 to 1,300 metres. So that encompasses a broad diversity of habitats. It's also regarded as some of the most remote and scenic wild land in Scotland, and it has many rarities and species of European importance on the ground. Next slide, please. The property was acquired by the National Trust for Scotland in 1995, and it was acquired for its conservation value. And there's three main objectives to the management. The first and primary objective is one of conservation of both the natural and cultural heritage. The second is to allow open public access to the estate for people to come and enjoy the landscape and wildlife here. And the third, slightly unusually, is also to continue to run as a Highland sporting estate, while that's still in harmony with the first two objectives. So we still do that at Marlodge, still shoot deer and shoot grouse as sporting activities. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bit of an insight into the sort of conservation value. So 83% of the estate has a European designation, a special protection area or a special area of conservation. And I'm not going to go through all these, but this is a list of the designations covered that cover the estate. So it's quite a heavily designated site, so really quite an important site in terms of nature conservation. Next slide, please. So one of the special features at Marlodge is we have 840 hectares of the Caledonian pine forest that used to cover a lot more of Scotland. This is a European priority habitat, and there's an obligation on the National Trust to actually, due to the designation, to bring this back into favourable condition. Until recently, it's been considered an unfavourable condition due to a history of heavy grazing and a lack of any sort of age range of trees, just these old trees. So yeah, there's a big incentive to bring that woodland into a more healthy condition. Next slide, please. So the history of the estate is really, until recently, it's been an old folks home for trees. So pretty much all these old granny pine, Scots pine trees that are so beautiful to look at, but really reflecting a forest that's in bad condition, with most of these trees over 200 years old. In the woodland, there's been a history of clearance for commercial exploitation of timber, but also to create grazing land in the glens. And then in the early 19th century, there was, with the Victorians, came the development of the open hill red deer stalking, which across a lot of Scotland led to very high deer numbers being maintained for shooting. And that has pretty much put an end to regeneration of any woodland in the uplands of Scotland in the last 200 years. And that's what's happened here at Marlodge. Next slide, please. So this is just a photo to illustrate. This photo is now probably 20 years old or so. And it just shows how the woodland as it was with all these old trees with no youngsters coming through at all, really. Next slide, please. This is just another one showing you the landscape of Marlodge and these kind of statuesque trees, which are immensely beautiful, but this picture reflects a dying woodland, really. Next slide, please. So in our forest plan for the estate, we had a number of sort of objectives, I guess. One was to achieve favourable condition status, and we wanted to establish sort of regeneration in the woodland, particularly in areas where mature trees were being lost and the seed source was going. But overall, we wanted to create suitable conditions to allow ongoing regeneration and expansion of the woodland. And once we had managed to get this going and improve the habitat, obviously that then cascades down and multiple other pinewood species benefit from that. And it's quite an important thing up here in the Cairngorms, where there's a lot of talk about landscape scale conservation, and a lot of focus is being put on improving connectivity of woodland, both within land holdings, but also across the landscape with neighbouring estates. So that's one of our key objectives, is to try and link up with our neighbours as well to create these wildlife corridors. Next slide, please. So we wanted to get this woodland in a more healthy state, and there's various ways we could have done that, but the decision was made to do that through reducing grazing pressure, not by fencing out herbivores, but by reducing them. So treating the root sort of problem rather than the, and getting to the crux of the grazing issue. We're lucky that we didn't have any livestock as such on Marlodge when the trust acquired the property in 95. It was mainly an issue with red and roe deer grazing pressure. So in 1995, over about 12,500 hectares of the estate where the Pinewood is situated, we started a deer reduction process with the aim to reduce the deer population to less than 5 deer per square kilometre. This, we found out quite quickly, is not very easy to do, but and it's been an adaptive management kind of situation using deer count data and a lot of habitat monitoring information to kind of change and adapt our deer management strategy over the years. And in 2009, we ended up introducing a sort of zero tolerance policy of deer in this area. This was based on just continued heavy browsing of seedlings and saplings. And we realised that really to get this forest going, we were going to have to take quite drastic action with respect to the grazers. So we've done that, and since 2010, we've had a deer density of actually less than 1 deer per kilometre square throughout this area. It's not a case of wanting to eradicate deer as such, but what we felt was needed was to get that deer grazing pressure down to give the forest a chance to get back on its feet. And in the future, we would hope that we can allow those a few more deer to be held within this part of the estate. And actually what's happened in response to that has been absolutely incredible, and we've hit the nail on the head now, and we're now seeing pine, broadleaf and montane species now responding and regenerating and thriving. It definitely hasn't been an easy road, and we've had a lot of discussion and at times controversy with neighbouring estates and with the local community. But I think we're now in quite a good position, and communication and relationships are good with the people around us. And I think more than anything, seeing the landscape come to life has changed a lot of people's minds about the deer numbers that should be held, I guess, in this sort of landscape. Next slide, please. So these are just a few graphs that I think nicely illustrate what's happened. So this is the deer population, deer per square kilometre that we have in the state. So it was up at about 20 in 1992, just before the trust acquired the estate, and we've reduced that right down into 2020 to less than 1. Next slide, please. And it's not rocket science. In response to that, you can obviously see that the browsing pressure is reduced from over 40% of trees being browsed down to now we hover around 5% of trees being browsed. Next slide, please. And then we can see a nice response from the growth of seedlings that we were monitoring. So we can see in the early years that the growth was very small, and at times many trees were going backwards, getting browsed every winter. But over the years, as the deer pressure has come down, the growth of the trees has accelerated, as we would expect. Next slide, please. And this is just a map of, the red indicates areas of regeneration. This map was in 2011, and we can fade into the 2016 map, which shows the expansion of the regeneration. And this was now 5 years ago. So actually this year we've just repeated this mapping exercise. We don't actually have the final maps, but I'm quite confident that we're going to see quite a major, further expansion of that woodland now after this year's monitoring, mapping. Next slide, please. So I've just put together some photos just to illustrate, because I think they're a really good sort of, visual representation of the change that has happened here. So this is showing one of my plots that was in 2005, and this is in 2020 with the pine regeneration coming through. None of this is planted, all seeded from the old granny pine trees. Next slide, please. This was just 10 years ago, 2011, and we can fade into this year's photo, 2021. And likewise, one more example, if we have the next slide, please. This was again 2011, and we've just repeated this photo, and this is us in 2021. So this is all what I've shown you in these pictures is primarily pine regeneration of the Scots pine, but we're also seeing really healthy recovery of the broadleaf species. So yep, you can see here, this is a view of the estate, and in the areas where we have a broadleaf seed source, we have quite extensive regeneration of birch and rowan and willows. Next slide, please. And then we're also seeing the pine creeping up the slopes. So this is just one of the hillsides at Marlodge, and we're now getting quite good regeneration up to, in many places, up to 700 meters altitude. But we have got pines and other species recorded now up at 900 meters in the Gorms. So it really gives you a true indication of what the potential is for woodland in the Gorms landscape. Next slide, please. We're seeing pine establish on the sort of mobile riparian areas, riversides and such like. And finally, next slide, Fabian, please. And then something that's really exciting us all up here is we're starting to see the recovery of the sort of montane woodlands. So juniper, dwarf birch, montane willow species are starting just to emerge out of the heather. I mean, many of them have been there all the time, but we just never saw them because they were grazed so heavily. But we're starting to see that come away. And I think that's a really, lovely indication that we could start to see this nice tree line transition from the sort of larger, birch and pine sort of slowly into the sort of stunted trees and then into these montane species. Yeah, I think that was all I was going to show you about the woodland, but I was just going to mention a few of our other ongoing conservation projects. So we're also involved in a big effort to restore montane willows, in particular a couple of rare species. So we've been collecting seed and working with Trees for Life up here in Scotland to try and reinforce some of these small, very small, fragile populations and give them the capacity to sort of self-perpetuate into the future. We're involved in some plant projects, so a reintroduction project with the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh of Alpine South Thistle, which is a plant which is confined to 4 or 5 ledges in Scotland now, but was once more widespread. And we're looking to try and restore that to Marlodge. And also a little tiny opposite end of the spectrum in terms of size, a little tiny plant, twin flower. It's a characteristic pinewood species, and it's in poor shape in the Gorms, with many of the patches just one single plant. So we're doing some work there to create new genetically diverse patches of twin flower that will give the plant the capacity to reproduce and expand itself. Next slide. Last two, we're involved in a narrow-headed ant translocation. Again, this is a rare ant species in the pinewood, and it's actually struggling at Marlodge partly because of the regeneration. It's managed to persist in the woodland because of the fragmented nature of the woodland, where it actually is truly a forest edge species. So we're doing a lot of work to try and sort of move it to the edge of the woodland, where again it will be able to continue itself without any intervention. And finally, something that we're really excited about is that in 2016, hen harriers returned to Marlodge, and we firmly believe that's in part a result of the reduced grazing pressure and improvement in the habitat quality for nesting by harriers. So we've been monitoring the harrier population, and now we have, the last couple of years, we've had 6 or 7 pairs breeding successfully on the estate. And we've been involved with RSPB in a satellite tagging project to sort of further look at their ecology and also the fate of these birds when they leave the estate. Next slide, please. So that was rather a quick run through it all, and hopefully I've managed to achieve it just about in time. Just to tell you that in case you're more interested in the work at Marlodge, and there's a book being recently published written by the seasonal ecologist here, Regeneration, the Rescue of a Wild Land, and it covers all the work we're doing at Marlodge in a very entertaining and informative manner. So feel free to look that up, and I would recommend to read it. And then finally, just to plug, to raise funds for our conservation work on the estate, we've developed a Pinewood Conservation Gin, so made from botanicals from the estate, with all the proceeds of that coming back in to fund the Pinewood conservation work. So if you fancy a read accompanied by a tipple, please feel free to look that one up as well. And that's all I was going to say tonight. So thank you very much, and it's been lovely to speak to you.
Thank you so much. It was really inspiring to see those granny trees being surrounded by their grandchildren again, and how fantastic about the hen harriers coming back. So I'm going to next hand you over to Ali Hawkins, who's an ecologist at Exmoor National Park Authority, and she's going to talk to us about their nature recovery vision.
Thanks very much, Emma. I'm delighted to be here tonight. That was a great talk from Shina there. I'm lucky enough to have worked on Exmoor as an ecologist for just over 20 years, my sins, and more recently before that, with Devon Wildlife Trust. But over the last few years, I've found that my role has had to evolve due to the nature and climate emergencies. And what I'm going to share with you this evening is perhaps a long way from the bat and butterfly surveys I used to do and the farm visits I've done through my career. Thanks, Fabian. Next slide, please. We know that climate change and biodiversity loss are accelerating at an alarming rate and posing a real threat to life as we know it. The farming practices and traditional ways of life on Exmoor that have helped sustain our very special landscape for centuries, along with the vital natural support systems they provide to towns and villages across the area, are all at stake without urgent action. Next slide, please. So, although we're very lucky to still have some fantastic habitats on Exmoor, upland oak woodland, lowland and upland heath, beautiful rivers and streams, and an amazing coastline, sadly the national park hasn't been immune to a decline in nature. 30% of moorland has been lost since 1940, and our peatlands have been degraded. In 2001, the Exmoor Biodiversity Action Plan stated that only 480 hectares of quality blanket bog remained. 13.5% of the national park is currently woodland, but not all of high nature value, with 32% conifer plantation and other areas poorly managed. We think we've only around 2,500 hectares of unimproved grassland left, making it now a very threatened habitat on Exmoor. 80% of our orchards have been lost, and the last survey of our rivers showed that most are not achieving good status on Exmoor. Next slide, please. So what about species on Exmoor? How are they doing? On the left of this table are some examples of species that are declining or already extinct. And on the right, species that are doing better. But are the species that are doing okay really at a sustainable population level? Some species are only doing well because of a lot of effort. And what about species we're not monitoring? We do not know enough about them. Next slide, please. So developed by the Nature Conservation Advisory Panel, which is a partnership of conservation agencies and landowning representatives, we've taken the ambition for wildlife from our statutory Exmoor Partnership Plan and developed a nature recovery vision, which will guide all of our future thinking and action. It's based on the Lawton principles of more, bigger, better and joined. We decided not to go down the route of doing detailed mapping. We wanted an outcome-based vision rather than a prescriptive one. We realised we had to face into the National Park's landscape designation and show how this can be maintained and enhanced while delivering for nature recovery. We wanted to create a vision that enables others to deliver nature that is in harmony with the landscape designation and cultural heritage. Next slide, please. So they say a picture paints 1,000 words, and we thought about the best way to communicate our vision and decided to commission 2 illustrations, working again with the fantastic wildlife artist Richard Allen. This first image shows the factors which are all leading to a decline in nature in our national park. Next slide, please. And this second image shows a vision for a nature-rich Exmoor, where Exmoor's rich mosaic of wildlife habitats are enhanced, extended and integrated into a network of nature-rich hubs with blurred edges between them and corridors linking them together. Wildlife is abundant and thriving and can easily move across the landscape and adapt to a changing climate. Exmoor's farmed landscape remains productive, with farmers ensuring that nature thrives while producing public goods and food. And people living in and visiting the national park are connected to nature. They understand and are inspired by Exmoor's special wildlife and are actively engaged in its conservation. Next slide, please. So our vision hits a number of key drivers, including the 25-year environment plan and Glover proposals. Next slide, please. So we set ourselves 4 targets to achieve by 2030. The first one is to bring 95% of existing wildlife areas into favourable condition, providing the core of our nature-rich hubs. We need to ensure that these areas are managed in a way which allows adaptation to climate change and builds in resilience while safeguarding our special species. Next slide, please. We want to create or restore an additional 4,500 hectares of priority habitat as nature corridors and buffers. So we want to up the area of woodland to 17% in line with the Climate Change Committee recommendations. Next slide, please. We want to establish 11,500 hectares of nature-friendly farming areas. That would be 30% of our current area of farmland. We feel there's tremendous potential here around a range of options based around a low-input regenerative system. We're not saying that we have the solutions, but we want to work with everyone to find a way forward for a sustainable farming future. Next slide, please. And we want to create 7,000 hectares or 10% of nature recovery opportunity areas where nature and natural processes are allowed to take their course. In these wilder areas, land will be allowed to recover, soils and water recharge their health, and wildlife will recolonise. We haven't actually used the word rewilding in the vision because we feel that sometimes it means different things to different people. Next slide, please. So by 2050, our vision is to have 75% of the national park in nature-rich condition, with the remaining areas allowing wildlife to move easily through them. Next slide, please. So our vision was adopted by National Park Authority members in November 2020. And while we've had some incredibly positive support, there's also been some strong negative reaction. And this article ended up on page 3 of the Telegraph. The intention was always that the vision should be an enabler for landowners to find a sustainable way forward with nature as a core. Perhaps in hindsight, the illustrations on their own were not ready to be shared, but needed a narrative to go with them. Next slide, please. Since the vision was adopted, we've engaged further with the farming community through the NFU, the Exmoor Hill Farming Network and FWAG Southwest to understand their concerns and get a better idea of what they would like to do with their land. Encouragingly, landowner feedback shows a convergence between what landowners say they would like to do for nature and our nature recovery vision. Key barriers they mention are funding, lack of information, and perhaps a need to change their farming systems. Next slide, please. Our nature recovery vision is already supporting the work of conservation partners and private landowners and farmers across Exmoor. This is at all scales, from people who perhaps have bought a house with a few acres to large private estates. For example, the Southwest Peatland Partnership has restored 2,500 hectares of peatlands across Exmoor since 1998 and has ambitious plans to deliver more across the National Park. The National Trust is making a fantastic contribution both from its Honeycutt and West Exmoor estates. It has a long-term vision of ecological restoration, which would see a much wilder, more dynamic landscape working much closer with natural processes that respects the historic environment and provides opportunities for diversified rural economic activity. So in addition to their existing nature-rich hubs, they have plans to create or restore 950 hectares of additional priority habitat in the next 50 years. And just a few weeks ago, their first beaver kit was born as part of an enclosed beaver trial. One farmer on Exmoor who particularly inspires me is Holly Purdy from Horner Farm. I love her ethos. Holly says, "We farm to our environment as opposed to changing our environment for our farming system. We believe in an integrated approach where production is not removed but run in harmony with our natural world. We listen to our animals, grasslands and soils to make informed choices to produce nutrient-rich food while rebuilding biodiversity. We believe these go hand in hand for a forward-thinking approach for Exmoor." So while some landowners are already embracing the idea of regenerative land management, for others, we need to bring them with us with small steps first. The National Park Authority has a new project called Sowing the Seeds, working with Exmoor farmers and smallholders to create new flower-rich meadows, which is already gaining a lot of interest. Final slide, please. So what are our next steps to deliver the vision? We want to work at all scales with landowners, land managers and communities across Exmoor. We want to celebrate where people are delivering great things for nature. We want to maximise opportunities like the Farming and Protected Landscape Scheme, which will be administered by National Park authorities, and ensure that the new ELM scheme brings the greatest benefits to Exmoor. And we want to connect people to nature and help them understand our vision. The photo there is of my own daughter Ella on a holiday in Scotland last year, encountering her first Scotch Argus butterfly. Just like to finally say that many people care deeply about Exmoor. Our nature recovery vision is about harnessing that passion to inspire fresh thinking about how best we manage the land in future for our rural communities and for our wildlife, orchestrated at a landscape scale. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Emma now.
Wow, that was another inspiring talk. I'm not going to summarise it just because we are running 5 minutes late, so I'm going to hand over straight to Phoebe Cox, who is from Derbyshire Wildlife Trust as the engagement officer, and she's going to talk to us about the exciting work they're doing at Wild Peak.
Thank you, and hello. As Emma said, I work at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, and over the past 4 months, I've been working to establish our Wild Peak project. So Wild Peak is Derbyshire Wildlife Trust's most ambitious rewilding project yet. It's working in close partnership with our landowners, local communities and project leaders to inspire and implement a landscape scale nature-led approach to nature's recovery. Next, please. So firstly, a little bit of background to the area for those that don't know. The Peak District is positioned between Manchester and Sheffield in the north of England, and it's made up of 2 primary areas, the Dark and the White Peak. The Wild Peak is based mostly in the Dark Peak area, a region that is famed for its breathtaking views and seemingly unpopulated upland expanses, a region that is sometimes thought of as wild. Unfortunately, though, as Emma noted earlier, for the most part, the region isn't very wild at all, with huge expanses of our upland areas being managed for grouse moors and sheep and cattle grazing. And like most of the areas in the UK, the region has experienced significant declines in its habitats and species. And not only is our remaining wildlife constrained by its shrinking habitat, a number of our species, particularly our raptors, are still facing persecution. With just this year, 3 young peregrine chicks robbed from their nest in the Dark Peak. However, if we take a little bit more of a positive outlook, there are a number of amazing organisations and projects currently running in the region, and we feel that the Wild Peak is really important and will be able to bring together all this good work. Next, please. I think we might have skipped forward. Yeah, fab, thank you. Okay, so the Wild Peak builds on Lawton's conservation principles of bigger, better, more and joined up. So not only is the project working towards creating and restoring wild places, it's also working to connect them, working within and between existing initiatives and conservation sites to create a network across the region. So the map on the left shows our boundary and the urban connection zone. So that's in green and dash green. And then within there is a number of pink areas, and these represent the nature-led conservation sites and existing pledges to the project. So our hopes are that in the coming years, this map will become more and more populated with these Wild Peak sites, with a long-term goal of having a connected network with some archetype sites across the region. So a bit more like the map on the right. And to achieve that, we do need the support of the public bodies and statutory undertakers like this campaign asks for. So if we include the land that is owned by the Natural Trust, our public bodies and statutory undertakers own over 20% of the land within our Wild Peak boundary, which this second map illustrates with the blue areas. And I think this is a really powerful illustration of the impact this campaign could have and the extent of nature recovery and connectivity that could be achieved with just half of this land being rewilded or managed with nature in mind. Next, please. Okay, so what are we doing? Well, one of the main tasks that I've been working on is developing our vision for the Wild Peak, which is made up of our intentions, long-term goals, and plans for the project. And we're currently collaborating on that with our Wildlife Trust partners and the local communities. So as well as a network of wild spaces, the project also really aims to develop a network of people and communities to facilitate, support, and celebrate nature's recovery. And I believe this is where we, as the Wildlife Trust, play a really important part, as one of our key strengths is that we are able to be that glue that connects and bring together the landowners and the community groups and the projects all across the region. People and communities are therefore at the heart of the project, and we're already witnessing the power that local people and grassroots initiatives have in establishing rewilding gains in the Wild Peak area. From just our early engagement with communities, we've been absolutely blown away with the local momentum and drive for change. For example, about a month or so ago, we went over to Whaley Bridge to meet with their local biodiversity group and have a walk and talk through their projects. And the group are already working to improve and rewild a number of sites across the town and have a keen focus on education and engaging the whole community, and therefore have been an incredible support in these first few months, spreading the word about the Wild Peak project and getting a number of new landowners on board. And I believe projects and groups like these are so valuable for making rewilding accessible and meaningful at a local scale. And so one of the most important elements of our work going forward is to support these people to make such changes, and in doing so, inspire others around them. So today we've visited and engaged with a number of these community groups, and we hope to do more of this in the coming months. And we're also working on a number of resources and training sessions that will be available on our website to support these groups and our landowners with their own rewilding journeys. If we move on to our work with landowners, so to date we have over 600 hectares of locally owned land pledged to rewilding, and now we're regularly out on site visiting new landowners and community groups that want to be involved. So if you can just skip back one slide. Fab, thank you. So the sites that we've got pledged range from species-rich meadows to established woodlands, then also ex-pasture land and roadside verges that have never been managed with nature in mind. The sites also have a huge geographic spread and a broad range of land ownerships, from our local landowners and farmers to large corporations like Hope Valley Cement Works. With every site we visit, we are giving them tailored land management advice to all of the landowners, and this is including developing a number of detailed land management and monitoring plans for some of our larger landowners. And on top of this, the project also encompasses a number of exciting research-based tasks. So this includes nature recovery network mapping. So this is using GIS software to model where the gaps and opportunities for rewilding are. We've also started undertaking a range of species reintroduction feasibility studies to understand how we can start to reintroduce some of these lost species back into our region. And then finally, we are also undertaking research into moving to a nature-based economy and how landowners can diversify their income streams. For this, we're meeting with a number of landowners and farmers to understand how their land currently generates them income and discuss how this can change in the future. And this is particularly poignant at the moment due to the upcoming changes in the land payment zones. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to wrap my presentation up and talk through how people can get involved with the Wild Peak project and what our next steps are. So there's three main avenues to get involved, and that's through land, time and money. So The first way anyone can get involved is through pledging some of their land, whether this is a garden, an area of a field, or a huge farming estate. Every bit of land helps to develop the nature recovery network. Then, depending on the size of the pledge, there's a range of different advice and resources we can support you with. Secondly is time. There is lots of existing rewilding projects and local biodiversity groups doing some amazing work in our region. So if people have time and want to get involved, what we're currently trying to do is connect them with these projects and groups. As the project grows, it's likely that we'll have more and more opportunities for volunteers. And what we aspire to have is a team of volunteers that can support the landowners with the work needed at the pledge sites. So, for example, we have an interested landowner that are looking to rewild an ex-clay pigeon shoot, but this site requires a lot of upfront work to remove the debris from the site. So the dream would be that we'd have a really supportive community of volunteers that can make projects like this a bit more manageable. So yeah, as well as land and volunteer time, Wild Peak also needs funding to deliver our work. Every penny donated means we can give more advice, create more habitat, and reintroduce more species. So for those short on time, they can make a huge difference by donating whatever they've got to the Wild Peak project. When our full website launches in September, we will have a live interactive map, which will allow you to make any of these pledges. But for the time being, if people want to get involved, we just ask they contact us via the inquiry form on our webpage or email us directly to get involved. So in the coming months, we'll hopefully be launching our project fully. And with this, doing more engagement work with the public and landowners to raise awareness and increase the number of pledges we've got. We'll also be building our relationship with our partners and other projects across the region so we can make a really effective joined up approach to rewilding in the area. Next, please. Finally, just thank you for listening and allowing me to share about some of the work that we've been getting up to in the Peak District. If you want to find out more about our project, please visit the project page on Derbyshire Wildlife Trust's website or drop us an email at Wild Peak. Thank you very much, and back to Emma.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. There's just so much optimism from tonight, just seeing a big groundswell of support for rewilding in our national parks. And I just also want to say how wonderful it is to see women speaking and representing the rewilding movement at tonight's event. So thank you again for your lovely talks. The final talk of the night is from Yolo Williams. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us in person, but he has done us a fantastic short video, which is all about how Welsh national parks can also play their role in rewilding. So we're going to air his video, which is around 4.5 minutes long, and then I'm going to hand straight over to Guy, who's going to lead our Q&A. I'm afraid we are running a little bit longer than I expected, so we might not be able to answer as many questions, but we'll try and get through what we can. So I'll hand it to Yolo Williams.
Hello there, my name's Yolo Williams, and I'm pleased to be a small part of this conference, trying to encourage our national parks to become much wilder and to benefit our biodiversity, our wildlife, our plants and animals much more than they're doing at present. I'm sitting in my garden. It's my little bungalow behind us, and you can see that part of my lawn is much wilder. I've just let it go from no grow mode to let it bloom June. I've cut bits of it. The bit behind me, you can see I cut occasionally. It's got bird's foot trefoil, it's got white clover on it. I've got other much wilder bits which earlier on had primroses, cowslips. It's now got knapweed, and it's fantastic. It's full of butterflies, it's full of bees. And just the other day I had a couple of linnets in my garden. Now, we don't get many linnets in the whole village here, but because I've allowed parts of my garden to go wild, well, that's attracted in the linnets. This is on a very small scale. I wish everybody did it, of course, but surely we should be doing this on a much bigger scale here in Wales. There are so many opportunities now, and we know that this is something that we really have to do. We cannot continue to manage the land in the way that we are doing. But importantly, I think it's vital that we take the local people, the local landowners, the local farmers with us. And in Wales, we have an added incentive. I am a Welsh speaker, first language Welsh speaker, and the backbone of that community, of the language and the culture, is the agricultural community. So it's just as important here in Wales that we keep people on the land. But we can and we must do this. We can take small measures, and our national parks must lead the way. At the moment, we have visitors coming over, particularly from England, from places like Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, and they say, isn't this beautiful? Because they see a green landscape. Well, as an ecologist, as a conservationist, we know it's not beautiful. It's, to an extent, a green desert, or large areas of it are green deserts. We could be doing more along the riparian zones, along the sides of our rivers. We should have a buffer. This would help river pollution. It would help our fish. It would help all kinds of wildlife in the river. If we planted some more trees in key areas, the right trees, of course, broad-leaved native trees, this would help against erosion. It would help to lock away some carbon. It would help to alleviate floods as well. And there are so many opportunities in some of the upland areas. Some of these areas here in Mid Wales, we have the Ylennydd, not a national park, but acre upon acre of Molinia, purple moorgrass, not very good for agriculture and certainly very poor for wildlife. So please, Welsh Government, let's look at a map of Wales. Let's look at it holistically. Let's look at it joined up. Let's look at landscape restoration. Let's work with local people. Let's encourage more people, local people, to stay on the land. Let's look after our wildlife. Let's look after our language. Let's look after our culture. I've just returned from Allerdale up in Scotland, a 23,000 acre reserve that's trying to restore much of the habitat there. They've planted almost 1 million native trees. They're hoping to get back good populations of things like red squirrel, ptarmigan, pine marten, otter. Well, they employ up to 12 people. The next door estates are deer stalking estates. Well, they employ between 3 and 4 people. So there's no reason why this approach cannot keep more people on the land. So please, we know we have to change. We have now the opportunity to change. Now that we're out of Europe, we can design our own agri-environment schemes here in the UK and here in Wales. And the national parks, please, anybody in authority within the national parks, and I know it's more complex here than it is abroad in that we have so many people living and working in our national parks, but surely you should be leading the way. Thank you for listening. Diolch yn fawr.
Well, that was absolutely wonderful. Thanks so much to Yolo for sending that video over. Awesome. We're now going to go into the question and answer session. We don't have very long, so we may not be able to answer everyone's questions that we've been getting through, but I would really like at least to put a question to each of the speakers. So I hope this isn't going to put anyone on the spot, but I've allocated a few questions, so hopefully you'll be able to answer these. We had a question which I think, Phoebe, you might be able to answer. You talked a little bit about this in your talk, but maybe you'd like to say a bit more about the economic case, what the economic case is for having wilder national parks. Is that something you're happy to chat to?
Yeah, I can touch upon that. So the work we're doing at the moment is mostly speaking with farmers and sort of talking through what they're currently doing. We recently had sort of a community workshop, and it was really interesting because the farmers were more than open to make these changes. They just wanted to understand how they could and sort of what the, sorry, a bit distracted, my dog just walked in. And they want to understand how they can access these fundings and the schemes that are coming out. So a part of our work is sort of looking at the new schemes that are coming in, and then we hopefully, along with another set of resources we'll have on our website, we'll have the pointers and the directions. So it's really accessible for everybody to understand these. But as I said, we're doing sort of one-on-one site visits with our landowners, and we are giving them that sort of tailored advice.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Phoebe. Yeah, and well done for coping with the bit of rewilding going on in the background. So another question. Maybe this one is best for, in fact, this is particularly a question for Shyla. Actually, there's two questions if I might bundle them together. One is hopefully a quite quick question, a factual question, which is what's the natural tree line in the Cairngorms? And also maybe leads on from that, how have you achieved a balance between reforestation and a sporting estate in your work in Marlodge?
Okay, so well, I think that what is a natural tree line is probably a bit debated, actually. I mean, people maybe would have thought it was around about the 650, 700 metre sort of mark. But I think what we're seeing now is that, you know, this is the first time we're really seeing trees being allowed to do what they want to do and grow where they want to grow, and they're not being impeded by anything. And I mean, we're definitely seeing here at Marlodge regeneration at 700 metres, but we're seeing trees up to 900 metres. So, I mean, my sort of prediction would be that in the future, when the woodland is established, we'd be looking at, you know, a good chunk of woodland going up to about, you know, obviously being impeded by the weather conditions and climate, but trees stretching up to 900 metres, really. Yep. I mean, they would be the shrubbier kind of willows and junipers and the odd stunted pine and such like, but I think that trees are capable of getting up to that altitude in places in the Cairngorms, definitely.
And just on that other sort of follow-on question, is there any sort of conflict between, or is there a way you found to sort of balance those different land uses, the sort of the sporting estate and the reforestation?
Yeah, I mean, that is quite an interesting one, because we are blessed with the beauty of having a very large piece of ground here at Marlodge. And so I said to you the estate was 30,000 hectares, but the regeneration and the deer management that we're carrying out for woodland regeneration is over sort of half, or just over half of that. And actually we have a large part of the western part of Marlodge where there's very little woodland currently. And at the moment, that's where we are able to conduct the majority of our sporting activities. But I think looking to the future, what I'd like to see, or what we'd like to see, is a kind of just sort of maybe taking on a bit more of the sort of Norwegian model, and maybe changing the approach to hunting, and, you know, away from the sort of necessarily, I mean, we don't do driven grouse here in Marlodge, but estates around us do, but away from that into more of a small game shooting in a woodland type setting. And also, you know, a slightly different model for shooting deer, like not the sort of characteristic large herds of deer on the open ground that Scotland's become sort of renowned for, but more of a continental kind of woodland stalking type approach. But I think I mean, to be honest about it, I mean, we've had to reduce the deer significantly to get the regeneration and get the woodland going. I think we would hope that in the future we can let those deer numbers come up a little, and that would allow for some sort of potentially, you know, sustainable type hunting or shooting in the forest. But yeah, is that clear?
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thanks, Shyla. I was always interested to read in Benedict MacDonald's book about his sort of comparisons of actually how wild hunting can be done much more sustainably in places like Norway. So it's great that you're sort of thinking about that sort of as a model as well. I've got a question which I think probably most naturally fits with David, so I hope he's up for answering this. But a question that's come in is, how do we address the perceptions of national parks as cultural landscapes? Ones that are, you know, usually quite poor for biodiversity, but are nevertheless cherished. And I guess particularly that might be the case with the English Lake District.
So for me, I think they're mutually exclusive, and I think I always view things like World Heritage and those cultural landscapes as very much a spectrum, a bit like many people view rewilding as a concept. And actually the sweet spot is in the middle, and that's where you will get the overlap between a range of public goods that are delivered on the kind of natural environment and the societal benefits, along with some of those kind of cultural goods that are delivered. So if you look at the Lake District National Park, for instance, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, inscripted for cultural heritage by and large, if you actually look at that designation around the World Heritage Site, a lot of the things that it includes are things like wood pasture, species-rich hay meadow management, mixed stocking, traditional stocking around kind of cattle and ponies and things like that. So yes, we might often see played out a portrayal of one particular line of that spectrum, a bit like people often portray things like rewilding as one particular end of a spectrum. But for me, the two are mutually exclusive, mutually compatible. So yeah, I don't see it as a conflict, and we've got many sites in places like the Lake District that us and other partners run, which both deliver World Heritage and those sort of cultural aspects of the landscape, alongside a range of kind of ecosystem services, kind of, yeah, where natural processes run wild, and some of the great things that we've seen at places like Marlodge, and that with some of our kind of montane plant communities, woodland establishment. Yeah, they just need carrying out carefully, so there is no conflict. But yeah, there shouldn't be conflict.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Yeah, that's a great answer. And with the Lake District, I've always been intrigued that we think of it as being Wordsworth's Republic of Shepherds, but we forget that Wordsworth also wrote about the former tree cover of the Lake District, and very movingly about how much had been lost. So there's sort of interesting aspects in which we could be reclaiming perhaps more of that sort of form of culture as well. I think we only have time for one more question. I'd like to give it to Ali, and I think it's a good one to close with. So hopefully you're up for this, Ali, which is what powers do national park authorities have to make these changes? And my added slightly leading question, which would be to add to that, and could they do with more powers?
Thanks for that question, Guy. So I think one of our, it's not a power, but one of the exciting opportunities coming up for us now over the next 3 years is the Farming in Protected Landscape Scheme, which the DEFRA have decided to give that pot of money to national parks authorities to deliver. And the themes are for climate, nature, people and place. So yeah, we see that as a really exciting opportunity to begin to start looking at the sort of nuts and bolts of our nature recovery vision, and what that looks like for farmers and landowners, and how they can begin to perhaps transition towards perhaps a different system where perhaps nature is slightly more central to their sort of farming operations. So we're quite excited that we have that opportunity to work with our landowners over the next few years as we head towards Elm. And it's so important that Elm comes up with the goods in terms of public money for public goods. So yes, I'd say that's a big opportunity for us over the next few years, and we're really excited and looking forward to delivering that.
Brilliant. And let's hope also that the government does come out with its proper full response to the Glover Review at some point. And
yes, we're looking forward to hearing that as well. Yeah,
that would be good. Great. Well, I think that's all we have time for really with the Q&A. So I'm just going to hand you back to Emma to wrap up this evening's event.
Thank you very much, everybody, and for sending your questions. I just want to say you've all been a fantastic audience. You've been really engaging in the YouTube chat, and Twitter's been going bonkers. So thank you so much for it being a two-way conversation tonight. There's been so much tonight, it's really hard to summarise. But I think I just want to reiterate, kind of touching on what Phoebe and Yolo Williams said, is about, even from rewilding, the things that we can do in our garden, to then what's happening in national parks. If we scale up all of our efforts, then we can create these amazing nature recovery networks. And as Yolo Williams said, it's something we can and we must do, and we need national parks to lead the way. And I feel like tonight's speakers have done a great job illustrating that when the right staff, skills, ambition and support is there, we can rewild our national parks. And by doing so, we're making them more robust, dynamic and resilient to future climate threats, alongside bringing a wealth of benefits to people, our culture and wildlife. As we say at Rewilding Britain, where nature thrives, we thrive. I just want to say again, thank you to all of our speakers for giving us such fantastic talks, and the effort into your slides and the energy is just really contagious. I also want to say thanks to Millie, Sarah and Richard, who have been busy and behind the scenes on the YouTube chat, trying to make sure as many questions have been answered. And thanks to Fabian, who's the technician behind making tonight happen. And if there's 2 actions you can do for the end of tonight, it's please sign and share our petition. We'll drop the link again on the chat and on social media. And a lot of you have been very eager to see the link to the Uplands animation. So we've just published today a brand new webpage which has this Uplands animation as part of it with a lot of information. So we'll be also popping that link on the YouTube chat now and across social media. And for anybody else that would like to know of any updates to our campaign, please head over to our website and sign up to our e-newsletter so that we can tell you what's happening and if we need your help in the future. A big thank you again to everybody and for joining us tonight. Thank you.